Hello everyone, I'm Zeba Bailey and this is the Philosophical Yogi. Welcome to part 2 of the Anjengo Uprising and Rebellion. Before I begin, if you haven't yet listened to the last episode, it may be useful to go back and hear Amir's telling of the history of Anjengo, but no pressure. This is not a classroom, this is a conversation. So welcome. If you're new, it's great to have you with us. Let's briefly revisit the history that Amir laid out for us in part 1 so we're all on the same page. In 1721, Anjengo Fort was besieged for 6 months. This siege followed a massacre that was triggered by what was supposed to be a tribute procession to the Rani of Attingal. Beneath the surface had been economic strain, cultural misreadings and many broken agreements. Over 100 East India Company men were killed in one event. At the centre were several characters: the Rani herself, Kudaman Pillai, a senior advisor, William Gifford and his wife Catherine. Each of them occupied a different moral architecture, and each embodied different forms of power and response. So today, rebellion is the thread I'm pulling on, not as violence alone, but as a rupture of moral and metaphysical proportions, and I'll explain why later. When older codes of order are trampled, rebellion becomes dharmic necessity. This is not revolution as spectacle, it is revolution as recalibration, a restoration of an inner architecture as a return to balance. So, where does all of this take place? In the land of pluralism, and also a land and a multiplicity of traditions and religions, including its largest by far, Hinduism, whose true name is Sanatana Dharma, or the eternal wisdom. It is not a faith-based system in the Western sense or in any sense, although often it may find itself included in world religions. Most Hindus would argue it isn't a religion at all, but lived, experiential and subjective. It is practiced and shared both individually and collectively through a vast interwoven cosmology. It is inclusive, evolving Brahman. Sanatana Dharma integrates 6 major schools of thought. These are called darshanas. Think of it as a vast living library, or to use a more modern metaphor, an infinite scroll. You may be drawn to one path or be born into a lineage, but exclusivity isn't simple or necessary when the tradition itself encompasses many lineages, epics, sages, and an 8,000-year-old Vedic wisdom. To study then Sanatana Dharma is to study the self. To practice it is not to accept a creed, but to enter a kind of continuous civilizational conversation and celebration. A metaphysical parliament that includes poetry, mathematics, ethics, music, praise and silence. And within it one finds no dogma, but wisdom, a wisdom of perspectives. The Dharma is plural by nature, and to view one is not to dismiss another. And so, this is the epic backdrop to the home of Kerala, with its own interpretation of Sanatana Dharma. And along that sacred thread came Anjengo Fort of Attingal, a fort at siege after a brutal and swiftly executed uprising against the East India Company, who were once maybe considered trading partners and who had become something far more threatening. So, let me explain to you my thinking behind what will follow as an attempt at philosophical commentary. Please imagine for a moment my quandary as to where to position this part 2, the philosophy, following part 1, the history. It is true that I could have chosen to focus this episode on one great work, the Bhagavad Gita, or drawn from the Upanishads as meditation, philosophy and consciousness, or perhaps the Shiva Sutras as to decipher comparisons with that of the great Mahayogi. I could have explored this account through Sankhya and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, or make some comparisons with stories from the Ramayana. But, although none would be easy, I felt that to isolate one thread was limiting the origin of the position of Bharat. As if simplifying matters to one aspect of the Hindu canon would miss out what I think is a greater message here, that this vast land of antiquity is the mother of wisdoms that we now experience more and more today. And most importantly, to the history of Anjengo, it would not have described their epic access to immense values or beliefs if I'd have kept it small. It would only serve to limit our view of them. I imagine that to the people of Anjengo and Attingal, ritual, discourse, theory, and mystical practices and experiences were a dynamic and integrated way of life. I would imagine further that their actions were shaped by their access to a living ecosystem of knowledge. They would have known their cosmology, and it is vast. Nor could I say with any certainty what this moment in history represents dharmically or subjectively to the individuals concerned, because the uprising of Anjengo at the time involved two lands, two entirely different cultures and civilizations, India and British. Values were understood in fundamentally different ways. One emerged from hierarchical Protestant commerce and maritime military trade, the other from a layered moral world of ritual kingship, spiritual authority, tantric agency, and land memory. These are not slight cultural differences, they are ontological chasms. So instead, I'll attempt to draw from both traditions, Vedic and Western. Let's start by saying that India, as we call it now, wasn't how it was referred to at the time. It was Bharat, Hindustan, Jampuvipa, and Aryavata, to name just a few. Each name for a different purpose: philosophy, territories within the land itself, or from neighbours and trading partners. Each name evokes a different cosmological scope to its origin. To call the land Bharat, for example, is to remember the epic inheritance of the Mahabharata. And to say Aryavata is to point to a sacred northern and central geography, famous for its development of Vedic culture. Now, whilst there appear to be many themes that come from this uprising from a philosophical standpoint, I've decided to focus on just a couple, although even then I may digress on occasion. Number one, broadly, how the philosophies of Bharat may have informed those who led and carried out the massacre and siege against the East India Company. And number two, the ripples to comparison we feel today. Can we truly rebel in an age where sincerity itself is under suspicion? So, as today, people may feel caught between obedience and integrity, belonging and betrayal, comfort and conscience, so must the people on both sides of the Anjengo rebellion. Clearly, they had begun to notice that lines were being crossed and signals were being sent that freedom, power and tradition were under threat, and therefore integrity of best action must have started to ruminate. But from what space does active rebellion rise? Should it be lasting, or should it just be a message? To clarify, could they rebel without mirroring the system they opposed? Would it be possible to recognize when a rebellion is dynamic, purposeful, to a higher good, or when it is ego-driven, a push for power and resistance to change? And most importantly, how is it possible to know this in real time? Let's firstly go to the Stoics, who would remind us it is not the action itself, but our perception that determines our judgment of the intention that matters. A view echoed in the broader Indo-European tradition. Or we can go to Greek philosophy, where perception and reason, inference and logic shape virtue and fate. However, in Vedic thought, perception and reason cannot be clear unless right seeing is achieved. That is, to clearly see without karmas, past or present, without samskaras, conditioning, and without memories that are affecting your perception. To go one further, in Vedic tradition, which is later returned to even in Advaita Vedanta, any proclamation of virtue has to go through 3 pillars. There must be Satya, truth, Viveka, discernment, and Anubhava, direct personal experience. Only when these 3 are integrated can a statement of fact be made. So then, Dharma for the people of Attingal would have resided somewhere in these philosophical teachings. Also, that which is yoga in its deepest sense. The unification of being with right action, free from attachment to outcomes, and to proclaim something as true is no small gesture. What must their conversations and deliberations have been like before they agreed the massacre of the British? The evidence of a brutal and disrespectful display from the East India Company towards their people was extreme. So who then is going to be best placed to act on their dharmic behalf? Enter the Kalari warriors. With their discipline of yoga, dharma and duty, guardians not only of land but of cosmic order, trained in the ancient martial art of Kalari Payatu, these warriors combined physical mastery with spiritual mastery and philosophical discipline. Their training is not merely for battle, but for inner equilibrium and spiritual awakening. They practice Kundalini, Maya Vidya, healing and harm sharing the same roots. Through yogic movement, breath control, sacred mantra, and Ayurvedic rituals, their bodies are vehicles of devotion, and in them the Dharma of protection, the art of restraint are intertwined. The Kalari Payatu are sometimes considered the world's oldest martial art, and its roots extend into temple rituals, Shiva Tantra, and ancestral worship. These are not mercenaries, these are the embodiments of a strong lineage. Their weapons are sanctified. Their practice spaces, Kalaris, are consecrated pits aligned with elemental energies, with the act of striking not divorced from ethics. It required discernment, precision, and the readiness to kill without anger or possessiveness. It is here that philosophy, physiology, and metaphysics merge in the flesh. The uprising at Anjengo, then, was indeed not simply a rebellion. It was an expression of embodied philosophy, to strike without hatred, to die without regret, to preserve sacred order through physical discipline. This is what the Kalari Payatu warrior carried. Now let's move on to Kudaman Pillai. He was just beyond the battlefield, an exemplar of the unseen strategist. His quiet orchestration of the rebellion reveals his discernment and patience and ability to act appropriately. For years he'd watched the erosion of honour and the tightening grip of the company. Yet he waited, not necessarily to only bide his time, but maybe to ensure the action was clear. He understood both the external terrain and the inner essence of the people. He did not match arrogance with arrogance. He possibly saw this as weakness and a lack of wisdom. His action came with both planning and precision. His silence was not passive, it was preparation. And when the moment arrived, his action struck not only at the body of empire, but at its assumptions of invincibility. This kind of strategic patience speaks to a deeper understanding of time, not just chronological, but Kali as Kairos, the opportune, a divinely aligned moment. It reflects a dharmic intelligence attuned to when to wait, when to hold, and when to act. We may also see in Kuduman Pillai a kind of Indian counterpart to the Confucian gentleman, or the Platonic guardian, someone who balances outer action with inner calibration. He was in many ways an instrument of cosmic timing, and yet his story remains obscure. We know little of his words and even less of his motives. In this obscurity lies a deeper truth, that Dharma does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits through silence. The rebellion exposed a clash not just of interests, but of epistemologies. The British Enlightenment mind, shaped by Locke, Bacon and Newton, prized reason, classification, progress and property. But in Anjengo that logic faltered. Here was a world where silence and Dharma carried power, where rebellion brewed not through obvious build-up, but through shifts, astrological timing in the sacred, memory and land. The empirical method failed to grasp the invincible force of prana shakti. Justice was served as Kali herself would, viciously. Eastern philosophy, particularly as embodied in Indian civilization, teaches that actions ripple through layers of causality, not just immediate, but karmic, not just material, but metaphysical. In that view, the uprising was not merely a strategic error, it was a consequence of adharma, a deviation from the moral order. With that, we must consider Anjengo's effects. They were indeed short-lived, although greatly impactful for a while. What might the East India Company have learned from their total and utter disaster? And how would this have informed future British rule of empire? For the East India Company, this was primarily a logistical and reputational disaster, a failure of diplomacy, intelligence, and fort security. Their response? Reinforcement, further expansion, total monopolization. For the British, they had begun to integrate that lesson, to sense that empire cannot be built on extraction alone, that without perceived reverence, without attention to cultural sensibilities and understanding of the land you occupy, you are not building an empire, but an entropy machine. However, the largest and most famous retaliation to the East India Company's direct rule on behalf of the British came with the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny. Then, the loss to the company was great, and it cost them their overt control of India. Their primary position was lost, and control passed to the Crown. For India, their loss was heavy indeed, and the response from the British would be severe and bloody. With Queen Victoria now Empress, their approach was noted to be more of an Orientalist perspective, as they called it, with an attempt to study, respect, and even mimic Indian systems of thought and rule. However, the purpose behind that was still shaped by utility. For example, to use the Sanskrit text to control the Brahmins, to translate the Dharma Shastras to use for governance, co-opt the culture rather than confront it directly. The game now has greater stakes, and deceit and manipulation alongside brute force is normalised. The cards have been revealed on both sides. However, let's remind ourselves that this is the land that invented snakes and ladders to teach moksha, liberation, to children. This land knew deeply that life was a long game with vices and virtues, and those virtues eventually arrived at liberation. and they had been teaching this to children since the 13th century BC. And it would be in the 20th century that figures like Gandhi, who acted from the root meaning Satyagara, truth force, Aurobindo, who spread the idea of revolution and organizing the people for non-cooperation and passive resistance against foreign rule, and Tagore, who said that true freedom required a moral and spiritual awakening in the 20th century, that we witness a deeper synthesis, a turning of empire's logic upon itself, using its own language of morality and justice to reveal the British Empire's and the East India Company's hypocrisy. The rebellion at Anjengo then becomes part of a longer arc, a moment when the soul of India stirred, not in grand declaration, but in precise resistance. Resistance of non-violence, of protest, of salt, and of prison, where the wisdom of masters of consciousness moved the masses. In Gandhi's view, that we must say yes when we mean yes, and we must say no when we mean no. That the idea of truth requires that vows taken should be fulfilled in the spirit as well as in the letter. And that brings us to the philosophical considerations for us here now. Who are the virtuous leaders of our time? Are we better humans today? Have there been any evolutions of rule at all? My first instinct is that these questions feel a little obvious, but still my intuition says, so what if they are obvious? Are they not obvious because they matter? Historically, we can observe, we can reflect. In fairness, righteous action Dharma is rarely obvious in real time, especially when one is caught in the conditioning of their own culture. The quiet violence of being unheard and the deafening silence of realizing you're trapped are all familiar. We all yearn for dignity, strength, and liberation. But are we paradoxically being conditioned to expect comfort? Unless we have personally felt the weight of racial, religious, or cultural degradation, or in fact any form of historical erasure, I must tread carefully in speaking for it, so I will leave those topics for those who know best. In our time, the echoes of Anjengo ripple forward. Tech giants, politics, and corporate machines bring with them resource extraction, manipulation of narrative, and modern-day tactics. Today, if you're anywhere near a smartphone, you will most likely find yourself caught in a causation loop of meaning-making under a haze of digital dopamine. Our phones are now shrines where godlike humans demand our attention with likes, comments, and shares, and all that serve to take our attention elsewhere. It is even considered a discipline now to bring your attention, focus, concentration towards what matters to you. We have more conversation, perhaps, more guerrilla media, sure, more truths from people on the ground, but more meaning? Are we, as Baudrillard proposed, trapped in a simulation of reality, a hall of mirrors in which the image replaces the essence and the symbols no longer point to any fixed truth? And in this spectacle, even authenticity becomes performance, the message devoured by the medium. As Baudrillard argued, in a world oversaturated with images and simulations, meaning itself begins to collapse. What we take for reality is often hyperreality, where symbols reference only themselves. In such a space, sincerity becomes stylized and performative. What was once a search for truth becomes a spectacle of signaling. This critique finds an echo in Indian epistemology, particularly from the lens of Maya, the illusion or distortion that veils the true nature of reality. Just as Baudrillard warns us not to mistake signs for substance, Indian thought reminds us not to mistake appearances for essence. Both urge us to re-examine how we see. None of us are free from Indra's web, just as many of us do not feel free from the World Wide Web. What once captured devas in a net of shining illusion now ensnares minds through scrolls, feeds, and notifications. One was cosmic, the other algorithmic, but both distort reality with a seductive force. We could argue that the hunger for meaning has grown over time, but the time we devote to wisdom has shrunk. Words flood our timelines, ephemeral wisdom shared in posts and reels, flanked by fear, beauty and destruction. A cocktail raised at sunset sits between the last life coach tip, a comedy sketch, a philosophical note, and heartbreaking news. The algorithm is always hungry. Agendas multiply, mutate, and manipulate. But could it be that somewhere in this torrent of information there will be real rumbles, real resilience, and a real reckoning? There are signs, and as Anjengo teaches us, they begin quietly, but they always begin, again and again, until the pendulum swings and balance is restored. Somewhere in time, the cosmos always replies according to the Dharma. There's no action without response, no karma without consequence. With the privilege of distance from this particular story of Anjengo, we can sit and we can dissect in our leisure. But perhaps in so doing, we are readying ourselves so that when our own moments come, we act not with confusion, but with clarity. That we speak truth, that yes means yes and no means no. It is good, I think, to remember Viveka discernment is learned, trust is earned, and right seeing takes practice. Both the Bhagavad Gita and Plato's allegory of the charioteer teaches us the soul must guide opposing forces, reason, and appetite into harmony. Even those with noble intent may act with ignorance. And, as Guruji Manashanandaji once said, it's okay to roar, to speak sharply, to fire a warning shot when the sacred is under threat. And as we return from the heart of this tale to a larger Vedic vision, time, in the Hindu cosmology, is both anatta, endless, cyclical, and kala, the devourer, the finisher. The Anjengo Uprising stands as a civilizational threshold, the closing of one arc, the opening of another. Like the Mahabharata, it unfolds across many endings and beginnings. In the Rig Veda, it is said, truth is one, the wise call it by many names. This is the pluralism of Indian Bharat philosophy. Until next time, thank you for listening.